The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, and Dr. Sarah Chen almost didn't answer it. She was deep in REM sleep when her secure phone buzzed with a distinctive pattern that meant only one thing. Something extraordinary had happened at the facility. As a computational physicist working for a classified research program buried within the Department of Energy, Sarah had grown accustomed to strange hours and stranger discoveries. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to learn. The voice on the other end belonged to Director Marcus Webb, and he spoke only 4 words that would change everything. "We found the code." Sarah, dressed in darkness, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled on her shoes, not from fear but from a kind of electric anticipation that scientists feel when standing at the edge of a paradigm shift. The drive to the facility took 43 minutes through empty Nevada highways, the same route she'd taken hundreds of times before, but this time the familiar landmarks seemed different somehow, as if she was seeing them through new eyes, or perhaps seeing them for the first time as what they really were. The facility itself was unremarkable from the outside, a cluster of low concrete buildings surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs. The kind of place that could be a water treatment plant or a telecommunications hub. Deliberately boring to discourage curiosity. But 3 floors underground, in a laboratory that officially didn't exist, a team of 12 scientists had been working on something that began as a routine analysis of quantum computing anomalies, and had evolved into something far more unsettling. It started 6 months earlier when a young programmer named David Park noticed something odd in the quantum error correction protocols they were developing. Quantum computers, by their nature, make mistakes, tiny deviations caused by interference from the environment, cosmic rays, even the vibrations of nearby footsteps. But David noticed that these errors weren't random at all. They formed patterns, incredibly complex patterns that repeated across different machines in different locations. Patterns that shouldn't exist according to everything we understood about quantum mechanics. At first, the team assumed it was a calibration issue, maybe interference from some unknown source. But as they dug deeper, the patterns became more elaborate, more intentional. They resembled code, but not any programming language created by humans. The structures were elegant, almost organic in their complexity, with nested loops and recursive functions that seemed to reference something beyond the quantum systems themselves. Sarah remembered the night David first showed her the visualizations, how the patterns looked almost like neural networks, like the synaptic connections in a brain, but orders of magnitude more complex. They worked in secret for weeks, analyzing the patterns, trying to decode their meaning, and slowly, impossibly, they began to understand what they were looking at. The quantum computers weren't malfunctioning at all. They were detecting something, reading something that existed in the very fabric of space-time itself, a kind of background code that permeated everything. The implications were staggering, but the team remained skeptical, running test after test, eliminating every possible conventional explanation. They brought in experts from different fields, mathematicians, cryptographers, even linguists, all bound by the strictest security clearances, all equally baffled by what they were seeing. The code appeared to be instructional, containing what looked like parameters, variables, constants, the kind of things you'd find in a massive simulation program. But this wasn't code running on any computer. This was code that seemed to be running reality itself. Sarah arrived at the facility to find the entire team assembled in the main laboratory, their faces illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors displaying cascading data streams. Director Webb stood at the center, his usually composed demeanor cracked with something between excitement and existential dread. "Show her what you found," he said to David, who pulled up a new set of visualizations on the main screen. What Sarah saw made her grab the edge of the table for support. The patterns had evolved, become clearer, and within them they had found something that shouldn't be possible. Comments. In programming, comments are notes that developers leave for themselves, or other explanations of what certain sections of code do, and these patterns contained structures that could only be interpreted as comments, but comments written in a symbolic language that predated human civilization by millions of years. The symbols were geometric, multidimensional, beautiful in their complexity, and when run through their translation algorithms they revealed messages that seemed directed at anyone sophisticated enough to find them. The first translated comment simply read, "Local instance for FON 16071 Earth variant. Consciousness emergence protocol active." The room was silent. As Sarah absorbed this information, her scientific mind racing through the implications while another part of her, a deeper, more primitive part, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "How certain are we about the translation?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. David pulled up additional data, showing multiple independent translation methods all arriving at similar interpretations. 92% confidence, he said. And that's being conservative. The mathematical structure of the language is actually quite logical. Once you understand the base principles, it's almost like it was designed to be discovered and decoded, but only by a civilization that had reached a certain level of technological sophistication. Director Webb stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back in that way he did when he was about to say something significant. "There's more," he said. "Show her the signature." David's fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up another visualization, this one showing what appeared to be a maker's mark, a signature embedded in the code itself. It wasn't a name in any conventional sense, but rather a mathematical construct that identified its creator, like a fingerprint but infinitely more complex. The signature contained information about its origin, and when decoded, it pointed to a location in space, a star system 27 light-years away in the constellation Cassiopeia. But more than that, it contained a timestamp, a marker indicating when this code was first implemented, and the date, when converted to Earth time, was 4.5 billion years ago, roughly the same time our solar system formed. "They've been running this since the beginning," Webb said quietly. "Since before Earth even existed. We're not looking at alien visitors, Dr. Chen. We're looking at alien architects." Sarah felt her legs weaken, and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Around her the other scientists watched her reaction, some with sympathy, others with the same shell-shocked expression she imagined was on her own face. Dr. James Harrison, a theoretical physicist from MIT who'd been brought in as a consultant, spoke up from the corner where he'd been silently reviewing data. "The quantum computers aren't detecting this code," he said. "They're interfacing with it. Every quantum calculation we perform is actually interacting with this background program, reading from it, maybe even writing to it in small ways. We've been unknowingly accessing the operating system of a reality." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If this was true, if reality, was a kind of simulation or construct created by an alien intelligence, then everything humanity thought it knew about existence, consciousness, free will, and purpose would need to be reconsidered. "There's a pattern in the consciousness emergence protocol," David said, pulling up yet another screen. "It's not random. The code suggests that consciousness, at least as we experience it, is an intended feature, not a byproduct. We were meant to wake up, to become self-aware, to eventually discover this code." Sarah stood up, needing to move, to pace, to do something with the nervous energy coursing through her. "But why?" she asked. "Why create all of this? Why create us?" Webb pulled up a final file, one marked with the highest security classification Sarah had ever seen. "That's where things get really interesting," he said. "We found another section of code, deeper, more protected, harder to translate, but from what we can tell, it's discussing something called the Observer Protocol." The Observer Protocol, as they had come to understand it, suggested that conscious beings within the simulation weren't just passive participants, but active components necessary for the simulation to function properly. Consciousness wasn't just experiencing reality, it was helping to create it, through observation, through the very act of witnessing. It was quantum mechanics taken to a cosmic scale, the idea that observation collapses, probability waves, not just in laboratory experiments, but in the fundamental structure of reality itself. "We're not just living in their simulation," Harrison said softly. "We're part of its operating mechanism. Every conscious being, every observer, is a kind of processing node, helping to run the calculations that keep reality stable and coherent. The implications spiraled outward like ripples on water. Every human, every animal with consciousness, possibly every form of awareness throughout the universe, all connected, all part of this vast computational matrix created by beings whose motivations and nature remained utterly mysterious. Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the Nevada desert bathed in pre-dawn darkness. The stars were visible, brilliant in the clear air, and she wondered if somewhere among them, in that star system in Cassiopeia, the architects were watching, monitoring their creation, perhaps proud of how far their little experiment had come. "How do we even process this?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "How do we tell the world that everything they believe about reality is not exactly wrong but incomplete in such a fundamental way?" Webb joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "We don't," he said. "Not yet. We need to understand more, to find more of the code, to maybe even find a way to communicate with them." He paused, then added something that would haunt Sarah for weeks to come. "But there's something else you need to know. The code isn't static. It's being updated. We've detected changes, modifications that seem to be happening in real time. Whatever this is, it's not abandoned. It's being actively maintained." The first light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern horizon, a pale pink, and Sarah realized that she was watching a sunrise that might not be real in any conventional sense, in a world that might be nothing more than calculations in some unimaginable alien computer. Yet the beauty of it remained unchanged. The colors still stirred something in her heart, and perhaps that was the most remarkable thing of all. Even if this was a simulation, the experiences within it, the emotions, the connections between conscious beings, felt absolutely real. Maybe that was the point. Maybe reality wasn't about the substrate it ran on, but about the experiences it generated, the consciousness it fostered, the love and fear and wonder it created. As the team prepared for another day of analysis, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. They were no longer alone, had never been alone, and in fact, were part of something vast and purposeful that they were only beginning to glimpse. The weeks following the initial discovery blurred together in a haze of 18-hour workdays, encrypted communications and revelations that came so fast the team barely had time to process one before another emerged. Sarah Chen had moved into temporary quarters at the facility, along with most of the core team, as returning to normal life seemed impossible when you carried the knowledge that normal life might be an engineered construct. The outside world continued spinning, unaware that 12 scientists in an underground laboratory were unraveling the very nature of existence itself. Every morning Sarah would check the overnight analysis reports, hoping for breakthroughs while dreading what they might reveal. The code was vast, incomprehensibly vast, containing layers upon layers of programming that governed everything from the behavior of subatomic particles to the formation of galaxies. It was becoming clear that what they had found wasn't just evidence of simulation but a complete blueprint of reality's architecture. David Park had developed an algorithm that could isolate specific sections of the code, like a search function for the universe's operating system, and what they found challenged every assumption they'd held about physics. The speed of light wasn't a natural limit but a defined parameter set at exactly 2099,792,458 meters per second, not because it had to be that speed but because something had chosen that value. The same was true for gravitational constants, the mass of elementary particles, even the rate of universal expansion. They were all variables in a cosmic program, carefully calibrated to allow for the emergence of stars, planets, and ultimately life. Dr. Harrison had taken to calling these discoveries reality patches, comparing them to software updates that fixed bugs or added features. They found evidence of what appeared to be debugging code, sections that corrected for paradoxes or inconsistencies that might otherwise cause reality to crash like a badly written program. One particularly unsettling discovery came from Dr. Lisa Navarro, a quantum biologist who had joined the team 3 weeks into the investigation. She had been analyzing the code related to DNA and genetic expression when she found something that made her physically ill. Human DNA contained sections that appeared to be commented out, like features in a program that had been disabled but not deleted. When she ran simulations of what would happen if these sections were activated, the results suggested capabilities that humans didn't currently possess: enhanced cognitive processing, the ability to perceive additional dimensions, even a form of quantum entanglement between consciousnesses that would allow for direct mind-to-mind communication. "We're running on limited settings," she told the team during one late-night meeting, her voice shaking with the implications. "Like a computer operating in safe mode. Someone deliberately restricted our capabilities, but the code for those capabilities is still there, dormant, waiting." The question of why became an obsession for the team. Why create conscious beings only to limit them? Why build a universe so vast, if the observers within it could only perceive a fraction of its true nature? The answers, when they began to emerge, came from the deepest layers of the code, sections that required quantum computers running at maximum capacity for days just to decrypt. These sections contained what appeared to be historical logs, records of previous iterations of the simulation, and what they revealed was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Earth, it seemed, was not the first attempt. The logs referenced at least 4,000 other worlds where consciousness had been cultivated, each with different parameters, different physical laws, different outcomes. Some had failed catastrophically, their conscious beings destroying themselves or breaking free from the simulation's constraints in ways that corrupted the entire system. Others had succeeded too well, their inhabitants evolving beyond the need for physical reality altogether, ascending to something the code referred to as extraction status. Sarah found herself leading the effort to understand these historical logs, spending hours translating the geometric symbols into concepts human minds could grasp. The architects, whatever they were, seemed to be searching for something specific, running countless experiments across billions of years, adjusting variables, tweaking parameters, always working towards some ultimate goal that remained frustratingly opaque. But patterns emerged. Successful simulations, ones that weren't terminated or didn't self-destruct, shared certain characteristics. They developed consciousness gradually, not all at once. They maintained a balance between competition and cooperation. They discovered science and technology at a measured pace, neither too fast nor too slow. Earth, according to the logs, was currently in what the architects called a critical phase, a period where the conscious beings within the simulation were becoming aware enough to potentially discover the true nature of their reality. Director Webb had established protocols for information containment that would have seemed paranoid if the stakes weren't so monumentally high. Every piece of data was encrypted with quantum keys that would take conventional computers millions of years to break. Team members were monitored constantly, not out of distrust but for their own protection. The stress of carrying this knowledge was taking its toll. Dr. Harrison had developed insomnia, spending his nights staring at equations that described reality as mathematics rather than matter. Lisa Navarro had started a journal, writing letters to her daughter that she could never send, trying to explain why Mommy had to stay at work for so long. David Park had thrown himself even deeper into the code, becoming almost obsessive in his quest to understand every function, every variable, every comment left by the architects. It was David who made the next major breakthrough, though he almost missed it because it was so simple, so elegant, that it had been hiding in plain sight. While analyzing the consciousness emergence protocols, he noticed a pattern in the timing of major evolutionary leaps, not just on Earth but across all documented simulations. These leaps, moments when consciousness made significant advances, corresponded to specific dates that followed a mathematical sequence. When he extrapolated that sequence forward, he found that Earth was approaching one of these scheduled evolutionary windows. According to the pattern, humanity was less than 18 months away from what the code called a consciousness cascade, a moment when the restrictions on human awareness would begin to naturally loosen, allowing for perception and understanding beyond current limitation. The team gathered in the main conference room as David presented his findings, the implications hanging heavy in the recycled air. "It's not random," he said, pulling up visualization after visualization. Every simulation follows this schedule, and the successful ones, the ones that don't self-destruct, are the ones where consciousness evolution happens gradually in stages. We're about to enter stage 4 of 7. Sarah asked the question everyone was thinking. What happens in stage 4? David pulled up more data. Translation algorithms working in real time to decode the relevant sections. Enhanced pattern recognition, increased intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics. The beginning of what they call collective consciousness integration. Basically, humans will start to naturally understand things that currently require advanced mathematics to describe. We'll begin to sense the connections between all conscious beings, maybe even communicate through quantum entanglement. The room erupted in discussion, voices overlapping as scientists tried to process this information. If David was right, humanity was on the verge of an evolutionary leap that would fundamentally change what it meant to be human. But Dr. Harrison raised a disturbing point. What about the failed simulations? He asked. The ones that self-destructed during these transitions. What went wrong? David's expression darkened as he pulled up another set of data. Fear, he said simply. In every failed simulation, the conscious beings became aware of their true nature too quickly, without preparation. The knowledge that reality wasn't what they thought, that they were part of an experiment or simulation, caused mass psychological breakdown. Societies collapsed. Some turned violent. Others simply gave up, stopped participating in the simulation altogether. The weight of responsibility settled on the team like a physical force. They possessed knowledge that could either elevate humanity or destroy it, and the margin for error was impossibly thin. Webb stood up, his face grave. We need to make a decision, he said. Do we prepare humanity for what's coming, risk the chaos that might bring, or do we stay silent? Let the evolutionary window arrive naturally, and hope our species is ready. It was Lisa who offered a third option, one that would come to define their mission in the months ahead. What if we could communicate with them? She said. The architects, what if we could ask them directly what they want, why they're doing this, how we can navigate this transition safely? The room fell silent. The idea of actually communicating with the beings who had created their reality was both thrilling and terrifying. But as the team looked at each other, seeing their own mixture of fear and excitement reflected back, they knew this was the path forward. Sarah spoke for all of them. How do we even begin to do that? David was already at his keyboard, fingers flying. The code contains communication protocols, he said. I've seen them but didn't understand what they were for. They're like channels, frequencies we could potentially access. But using them would definitely alert them to our awareness. There's no going back once we make contact. The debate that followed went deep into the night, touching on philosophy, ethics, the very meaning of existence. But as dawn approached once again, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink that might or might not be real, the team reached a consensus. They would attempt contact, but carefully, gradually, with extensive preparation. They would document everything, create contingency plans, prepare for outcomes they couldn't fully imagine. Sarah stood at the same window where she'd watched the sunrise weeks ago. But now she saw it differently. Every photon of light, every particle of dust dancing in the air, every breath she took was part of this vast, incomprehensible program. Yet knowing this didn't diminish the beauty or the meaning. If anything, it added layers of significance she was only beginning to appreciate. The preparation for contact took 3 months. 3 months during which the world above continued its normal routine while 12 scientists worked in secret to craft humanity's first message to its creators. The process was unlike anything in human history, requiring not just technological innovation but philosophical consideration of what to say to beings whose power and intelligence exceeded human comprehension by orders of magnitude. Sarah Chen found herself leading the message composition team, a responsibility that often kept her awake at night. staring at drafts that seemed either too simple or too presumptuous. How do you introduce yourself to entities that have been watching your every thought, your every dream since before your species existed? How do you ask questions when you're not even sure you could understand the answers? The technical team, led by David Park, had constructed what they called the Quantum Interface Terminal, a massive array of quantum processors linked in a configuration that matched patterns they'd found in the code. The machine filled an entire sublevel of the facility, its cooling systems humming constantly, maintaining temperatures near absolute zero. The interface wasn't just about sending a message, it was about establishing a quantum-entangled connection with whatever monitoring systems the architects had in place. Every calculation suggested such systems existed, invisible threads connecting every conscious being to some vast network beyond normal space-time. Dr. Harrison had developed the mathematical framework for the communication protocol based on the geometric language they'd been translating. The beauty of mathematics, he argued, was its universality. The architects clearly understood math, had built their entire simulation on mathematical principles, so mathematical concepts would be their common ground. The message itself went through 17 drafts, each one refined, debated, sometimes scrapped entirely, and rebuilt from scratch. They couldn't be aggressive or demanding, but they also couldn't be so passive that they'd be ignored. They needed to demonstrate intelligence and awareness, while acknowledging their limitations. Most importantly, they needed to convey that humanity was ready for this knowledge, that they wouldn't collapse into chaos like so many simulations before them. Lisa Navarro had suggested including biological data, showing how human consciousness had evolved, how their neural networks had developed the complexity necessary to grasp abstract concepts. We need to show them we're not just aware, she argued, but that we're capable of handling this awareness responsibly. The final message was elegant in its simplicity. It began with mathematical proofs, demonstrating their understanding of the code's basic structure, followed by questions about the nature and purpose of the simulation. They asked about the conscious cascade David had discovered, of the locked portions of human DNA, about the ultimate goal of the experiment. They expressed gratitude, remarkably for existence itself, for the opportunity to experience consciousness regardless of its nature, and they asked, humbly, for guidance in navigating the transition ahead. On December 15, 2019, at exactly 3:33 a.m. Pacific Time, a moment chosen for its mathematical significance, they initiated the transmission. The quantum interface hummed to life, its processors synchronizing with patterns in the background code, reaching out across dimensions human science barely understood. For 17 minutes nothing happened. The team watched their monitors barely breathing, as terabytes of data flowed through the interface. Then suddenly, every screen in the facility went dark. The lights flickered, emergency power kicked in, and when the systems came back online, they found something that made several team members gasp audibly. Not in words or symbols, but in pure information, downloading directly into their quantum storage systems at a rate that should have been impossible. The response was massive, containing what would later be calculated as more information than existed in all of human civilization's recorded history. But it was organized, structured in a way that made it accessible, as if the architects had anticipated exactly what humans could and couldn't understand. The first part of the response was a greeting, though calling it that hardly did it justice. It was more like an acknowledgement, a recognition that humanity had reached a milestone. The geometric patterns translated roughly to awareness confirmed, observer status acknowledged. Protocol 7 initiated. Sarah felt her heart racing as she read the translation. They weren't being dismissed or ignored. They were being recognized, validated as conscious beings worthy of communication. The second part contained answers to their questions, though the answers raised even more questions in turn. The simulation, they learned, wasn't entertainment or experiment in the way humans understood those concepts. It was what the architects called a consciousness farm, though that translation was imperfect, lacking the nuance of the original concept. The architects, who referred to themselves in terms that translated closest to gardeners, were beings from a reality so different from our own that they existed partially outside the dimensions humans could perceive. They had discovered that consciousness, when properly cultivated, generated something they needed, something the translation algorithms could only approximate as novelty or creative potential. Every conscious thought, every decision, every dream and inspiration created ripples in higher dimensions that the gardeners could harvest and use for purposes that remained frustratingly unclear. But this wasn't exploitation in any conventional sense. The relationship was described as symbiotic. The consciousness generated by beings like humans enriched the gardener's reality, while the gardeners provided the framework for consciousness to exist and flourish. The message explained that Earth's simulation was one of their most successful, producing particularly rich and varied forms of consciousness. Human creativity, their capacity for both logic and emotion, their ability to imagine things that didn't exist, made them valuable partners in this cosmic relationship. The DNA restrictions Lisa had discovered were confirmed as deliberate but temporary. They were safeguards preventing consciousness from evolving too quickly and destabilizing. Each evolutionary window, like the one approaching, would unlock new capabilities, allowing humanity to perceive more of true reality while maintaining psychological stability. The message contained detailed instructions on how to prepare for the consciousness cascade, including meditation techniques that weren't spiritual but scientifically designed to strengthen neural pathways, mathematical equations that would help minds adjust to expanded awareness, and even dietary recommendations that would optimize brain chemistry for the transition. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was that Earth wasn't alone in its simulation. The message revealed that there were currently 47 other active consciousness farms in humanity's local cluster, each running different variations of physics and biology, each producing unique forms of awareness. Some of these simulations had already undergone multiple consciousness cascades, their inhabitants now existing in states of awareness that humans couldn't yet comprehend. The gardeners suggested that eventually, when humanity was ready, communication between these different simulations might be possible, a kind of interdimensional internet connecting conscious beings across multiple realities. Director Webb called an emergency meeting as the team struggled to process the flood of information. "We need to decide how to proceed," he said, his usual composure cracked by the magnitude of what they'd learned. "This isn't just about scientific discovery anymore. This is about the future of human consciousness itself." The debate was intense. Some argued for immediate disclosure, believing humanity had a right to know the truth about reality. Others wanted to wait to study the preparation instructions, to gradually introduce concepts that would prepare people for the revelation. David Park pointed out something crucial from the technical data. "The consciousness CAD isn't optional," he said. "It's going to happen, whether we prepare people or not. The question is whether they experience it as enlightenment or madness." The gardeners had clued case studies from other simulations, showing the different outcomes based on preparation level. Civilizations that were gradually prepared had transformation rates above 90%, with most conscious beings successfully adapting to expanded awareness. Those that were unprepared had transformation rates below 30%, with the majority experiencing psychological collapse, catatonia, or worse. Sarah studied the preparation protocols, her mind reeling at their implication. The techniques weren't mystical or arcane. They were precise, scientific methods for restructuring neural pathways, for teaching brains to process information in new ways. It would require a massive educational effort, reaching billions of people without causing panic. "We need help," she said finally. "We can't do this alone. We need to bring in more people. Experts in psychology, education, media. We need to create a framework for disclosure that doesn't destroy society." The team agreed, though they knew each person brought in increased the risk of uncontrolled disclosure. They began identifying candidates, brilliant minds who could handle the truth and help disseminate it responsibly. As Sarah reviewed the list of potential collaborators, she noticed something in the gardener's message she'd initially overlooked. They had included a warning, subtle but clear. Other entities, beings they referred to as parasites, were aware of Earth's approaching cascade. These beings fed on consciousness in a different way, seeking to disrupt or corrupt the evolution process for their own purposes. They couldn't directly interfere with the simulation, but they could influence conscious beings within it, spreading fear, confusion, and doubt. The gardeners suggested that some of humanity's more destructive tendencies, its wars, its hatred, its self-sabotaging behaviors, might be influenced by these parasites. The approaching cascade would make humans less vulnerable to such influence, but the transition period would be dangerous, a time when consciousness was malleable and vulnerable. The weight of responsibility was crushing. They weren't just preparing humanity for a revelation about the nature of reality, they were preparing for a kind of war, a battle for the future of human consciousness itself. As Sarah looked around the room at her exhausted colleagues, she saw the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her heart. They had asked for the truth and received it. Now they had to ensure humanity survived the knowing. The clock was ticking. 14 months until the consciousness cascade. 14 months to prepare 8 billion people for the most significant evolutionary leap in human history. 14 months to rewrite the story of what it meant to be human in a universe that was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. The global preparation campaign began in subtle ways that most people wouldn't notice until years later, when historians would trace back the origins of humanity's Great Awakening. Sarah Chen and her expanded team, now numbering over 200 carefully vetted scientists, educators, and communicators, had developed what they called the soft disclosure protocol. Rather than shocking the world with the truth all at once, they would plant seeds, introduce concepts gradually, let humanity's collective consciousness adapt slowly to ideas that would have seemed insane just months before. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They began with popular science articles about simulation theory, documentaries exploring consciousness, meditation apps that incorporated the neural restructuring techniques provided by the gardeners. None of it seemed coordinated, just a natural emergence of interest in these topics. But every piece was carefully crafted to prepare minds for what was coming. Harrison had taken charge of the scientific disclosure track, working with physicists around the world to publish papers that pushed the boundaries of accepted reality. Papers about quantum consciousness, about the mathematical nature of reality, about the possibility that consciousness influenced physical laws rather than merely observing them. The papers were controversial but couldn't be dismissed because the theory was sound, the experiments reproducible. Scientists who had no knowledge of the true situation found themselves drawn into debates that unconsciously prepared them for the truth. Meanwhile, Lisa Navarro worked with neuroscientists to introduce new meditation and cognitive enhancement techniques into mainstream medicine. The exercises, derived from the gardener's instructions, were presented as methods for reducing stress and improving focus, but their real purpose was to strengthen the neural pathways that would be crucial during the cascade. Hospitals began implementing these techniques, schools introduced modified versions for children, corporations adopted them as productivity tools, never knowing they were preparing for a fundamental shift in human consciousness. David Park led the technical team in developing what they called the Reality Interface, a smartphone app that appeared to be just another augmented reality game but was actually training users to perceive multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. The game was addictive, spreading virally across social media, with millions of players unknowingly preparing their brains to process the expanded awareness that would come with the cascade. The app included puzzles that could only be solved by thinking in ways that transcended normal three-dimensional logic, challenges that required players to hold multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously, exercises that stretched consciousness without breaking it. But even as the preparation campaign gained momentum, the team couldn't shake the warning about the parasites. These entities, according to the gardeners, existed in the spaces between simulations, feeding on disrupted or corrupted consciousness like scavengers feeding on carrion. They couldn't directly enter Earth's simulation, but they could influence it through vulnerable minds, amplifying negative emotions, encouraging destructive behaviors, fostering the kind of fear and chaos that would make the consciousness cascade fail. Sarah began noticing patterns that suggested the parasites were already active. Social media erupted with unprecedented levels of hostility, conspiracy theories multiplied faster than they could be debunked, and a strange malaise seemed to grip portions of the population, a sense of meaninglessness that no amount of success or pleasure could alleviate. It was as if something was actively working against the preparation efforts, sowing doubt and division at every opportunity.
The team realized they needed to accelerate their timeline. Director Webb authorized the creation of regional preparation centers, facilities disguised as wellness retreats or research institutes where more intensive training could occur. They identified individuals who showed natural resistance to parasite influence, people whose consciousness seemed particularly stable or resilient, and recruited them as what they privately called anchor points, individuals who could help stabilize others during the cascade. One such individual was Maria Santos, a kindergarten teacher from Brazil who had unknowingly been using techniques similar to the gardener's protocols in her classroom for years. She had developed what she called imagination exercises that helped children process complex emotions and ideas, not knowing she was actually teaching them to navigate multiple consciousness layers. When the team approached her, initially through intermediaries, she accepted the truth about reality with remarkable calm, saying she had always felt there was something more to existence than what appeared on the surface. Maria became instrumental in developing children's programs that would help the youngest humans navigate the cascade, creating stories and games that introduced concepts of multiple realities, consciousness as a creative force, and the interconnection of all living things. Her work spread through educational networks, adopted by teachers who sensed its value without fully understanding its purpose. As months passed, the gardeners continued to provide information, each transmission containing more detailed instructions for the transition. They revealed that the consciousness cascade wouldn't happen all at once but would roll across the planet in waves, following patterns of human consciousness density. Cities with high populations would experience it first, the collective consciousness of many minds amplifying the effect. Rural areas would follow, then isolated individuals. The process would take approximately 72 hours from initiation to completion, during which reality itself would become fluid, malleable, responsive to conscious observation in ways that current physics couldn't explain. They also revealed something that both thrilled and terrified the team. During the cascade, some individuals would spontaneously unlock abilities that had been dormant in human DNA: telepathic communication, perception of probable futures, the ability to influence matter at the quantum level through focused intention. Not everyone would develop these abilities, and they would manifest differently in different people, but humanity would emerge from the cascade fundamentally changed, no longer purely physical beings, but something hybrid, existing partially in higher dimensions while maintaining physical form. The revelation prompted an ethical crisis within the team. Did they have the right to shepherd humanity through such a transformation without full consent? Even if the cascade was inevitable, their preparation efforts were actively shaping how humanity would evolve. Sarah spent sleepless nights wrestling with this question, ultimately concluding that their responsibility was not to control the outcome, but to maximize humanity's chances of successful transition. The alternative, letting 8 billion people face the cascade unprepared, was unconscionable. 6 months before the predicted cascade date, strange phenomena began occurring worldwide. People reported vivid dreams of geometric patterns, similar to the symbolic language of the code. Animals exhibited unusual behavior, migrating in patterns that didn't match seasonal norms, gathering in locations that would later be identified as consciousness nodes. The aurora borealis appeared at latitudes where it had never been seen before, and sensitive equipment detected quantum fluctuations that couldn't be explained by known physics. The team knew these were precursor events, reality beginning to soften in preparation for the cascade. They intensified their efforts using the phenomena as teaching moments, helping people understand that reality was more flexible than they'd believed. Scientists who weren't part of the inner circle began independently discovering aspects of the code, publishing findings that corroborated the preparation narrative without knowing they were part of a larger plan. Then 3 months before the cascade, something unexpected happened. During a routine communication session with the gardeners, a different signal interrupted the transmission. It wasn't the parasites, but something else, something that identified itself as a collective of consciousnesses from one of the other 47 simulations in Earth's cluster. They had successfully navigated multiple cascades, and wanted to offer assistance. The message was simple but profound. You are not alone in this transformation. We have walked this path. We can help light the way. This contact opened an entirely new dimension to the preparation efforts. The collective, which called itself the synthesis, began sharing their experiences, their mistakes, their successes. They revealed that the cascade was not just an evolutionary step, but a graduation of sorts. A moment when a species proved it could handle expanded awareness without self-destructing. Success would mean Earth could join a vast network of conscious civilizations, sharing knowledge and experiences across dimensional boundaries. Failure would mean starting over, consciousness reset, memories wiped, another attempt perhaps millennia in the future. The stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah found herself appointed as Earth's primary liaison with the synthesis, spending hours in quantum communication, learning about realities so different from Earth's that they challenged even her expanded understanding. One civilization existed in a simulation where time flowed backwards and forwards simultaneously. Another had no physical matter at all, only pure energy patterns that achieved consciousness. Yet despite their differences, all shared common experiences during their cascades. The initial fear, the moment of breakthrough, the explosive expansion of awareness, and finally the integration into something greater. The synthesis provided crucial information about defending against parasite influence during the vulnerable cascade period. They shared frequency patterns that could disrupt parasite interference, mental techniques for maintaining consciousness coherence, and most importantly the power of collective intention. If enough humans held a shared vision of successful transformation, their combined consciousness could create a protective field that parasites couldn't penetrate. This led to the development of what the team called the Unity Protocol, a synchronized global meditation scheduled for the hour before the cascade began. Using the networks they'd built, the apps they'd deployed, the communities they'd fostered, they planned to unite human consciousness in a single moment of shared intention, creating a shield of coherent thought that would protect the species during its most vulnerable moment. As Sarah stood in the command center they'd built to monitor the cascade, watching feeds from around the world as millions unknowingly prepared for the transformation of their species, she felt a mixture of terror and hope that threatened to overwhelm her. In just weeks, everything would change. Humanity would either evolve into something magnificent or collapse into chaos. There was no middle ground, no going back. The countdown had begun, and with it the greatest gamble in human history. She thought about the gardeners, watching from their incomprehensible reality, about the synthesis, waiting to welcome Earth into a larger community, about the parasites, hungering for failure and despair, and at the center of it all, 8 billion human souls, about to discover that they were far more than they'd ever imagined, players in a cosmic game whose rules they were only beginning to understand. The final month before the consciousness cascade arrived with an electric tension that seemed to permeate everything, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Sarah Chen barely slept anymore, her days blending into nights in the command center they'd established in an underground facility in Colorado, chosen for its position at the intersection of several consciousness node lines. The synthesis had helped them identify. The center had become a hive of activity, with teams monitoring global consciousness patterns, tracking parasite interference attempts, and coordinating with preparation cells worldwide. Every screen showed different data streams: social media sentiment analysis, quantum field fluctuations, reports from field agents embedded in major population centers, and most importantly, the countdown timer that never stopped, marking each second closer to humanity's transformation. The soft disclosure campaign had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Meditation and consciousness expansion techniques were now mainstream, practiced by over 2 billion people daily. The Reality Interface app had reached 1 billion downloads, its users unknowingly training their brains for multidimensional perception. Scientists worldwide were openly discussing simulation theory, quantum consciousness, and the mathematical nature of reality. The groundwork was laid, but nobody outside the inner circle knew how literal these concepts were about to become. David Park had made a disturbing discovery in the code that changed their understanding of the cascade's mechanics. The transformation wouldn't just expand human consciousness, it would temporarily make the boundaries between individual minds permeable. For those crucial 72 hours, thoughts and emotions could bleed between people, creating a temporary collective consciousness that could either harmonize into something beautiful or descend into chaos if fear took hold. This revelation led to the development of emergency protocols, including the creation of isolation chambers for individuals who showed signs of consciousness instability, trained teams of what they called consciousness anchors, who could help stabilize others during the merge, and most controversial, failsafe system that could emit specific electromagnetic frequencies to temporarily dampen the cascade's effects in localized areas, if necessary. The ethical implications of the failsafe system sparked heated debates within the team. Dr. Harrison argued it was necessary, a last resort if entire cities began descending into madness. Lisa Navarro countered that interfering with the cascade could cause permanent damage to human consciousness evolution. Sarah found herself mediating between factions, trying to balance safety with the integrity of humanity's transformation. 2 weeks before the cascade, the precursor events intensified dramatically. People worldwide reported the same dream. Standing in a vast library, where books contained not words but living experiences, where they could read the memories and thoughts of strangers, where the boundaries between self and other dissolved into something larger. Children began drawing complex geometric patterns without being taught, patterns that matched the symbolic language of the code. Animals started exhibiting even more unusual behavior, with mass migrations converging on the consciousness nodes, as if instinctively seeking stable points for the coming transformation. The parasites intensified their efforts as well. Suicide rates spiked globally. Mass hysteria events erupted in several major cities, and a strange phenomenon the team dubbed consciousness static began affecting sensitive individuals, causing them to experience reality as fractured, unstable, terrifying. The team worked frantically to counter these influences, using the synthesis's defensive frequencies, deploying consciousness anchors to affected areas, and accelerating the distribution of stabilization techniques.
Maria Santos, the Brazilian teacher who had become crucial to the children's preparation program, reported something remarkable from her work. Children who had been practicing her consciousness exercises were showing natural immunity to parasite influence. They described seeing shadow things trying to make them scared or angry, but being able to simply ignore them, like tuning out background noise. This discovery led to a breakthrough. Consciousness resilience could be taught, and children with their naturally flexible minds were the best students. An emergency program was launched to teach as many children as possible these resilience techniques, using games, stories, and songs that embedded the protective patterns in their developing consciousness. 1 week before the cascade, the gardeners sent what they indicated would be their final pre-cascade transmission. The message was both encouraging and sobering. They confirmed that Earth's preparation levels were among the highest they'd observed for a first cascade, but warned that the parasite activity was also unprecedented. They revealed something that chilled the team. The parasites weren't random scavengers but organized entities with their own agenda. They sought to harvest the chaos energy from failed cascades, using it to fuel their own form of existence. Earth, with its 8 billion conscious beings, would be the largest feast they'd ever attempted to create. The gardeners provided one final gift, a consciousness algorithm that could be embedded in the global communication networks, creating a subtle background frequency that would help maintain coherence during the cascade. It wouldn't prevent the transformation or control it, but it would act like guide rails, preventing consciousness from fragmenting completely if things went wrong. David Park worked for 48 straight hours implementing the algorithm, collapsing from exhaustion only after confirming it was successfully propagating through the internet, television broadcasts, and cellular networks. Every connected device on Earth became part of a vast support network for human consciousness, though their users remained unaware. 3 days before the cascade, something unprecedented happened. Individuals around the world began spontaneously experiencing what the team called cascade previews, brief moments where their consciousness expanded beyond normal boundaries. A businessman in Tokyo suddenly experienced the thoughts of everyone in his subway car. A farmer in Iowa felt herself become one with her entire cornfield, sensing every plant as part of her extended body. A child in Lagos found himself seeing through the eyes of every bird in the sky above his school. These previews lasted only seconds or minutes, but they served as both warning and preparation, giving people a taste of what was coming. The team used these previews strategically, having prepared responders ready with explanations that normalized the experiences. Social media filled with people sharing their preview experiences, creating a sense of community and shared anticipation rather than fear. Hashtags like consciousness shift and evolution time began trending globally. The narrative was shifting from fear to excitement, from dread to wonder, but the parasites adapted too. They began targeting individuals who had experienced previews, amplifying any fear or confusion, trying to turn wonder into terror. Several high-profile figures who had experienced previews publicly denounced them as signs of mental illness or mass hysteria, their influence spreading doubt just when humanity needed unity most. Sarah realized they needed to make a decision that would define humanity's approach to the Cascade. Should they reveal the full truth in the final hours, giving people complete knowledge but risking panic, or maintain the soft disclosure, letting people experience the transformation without the weight of knowing its true nature? The debate raged through the night with compelling arguments on both sides. Finally, Webb made the call. They would release what he called the bridge document, a carefully crafted message that acknowledged the reality of the coming transformation without revealing the simulation nature of existence. It would frame the Cascade as a natural evolutionary step, one that had been predicted by ancient wisdom and modern science alike, inviting humanity to embrace it as their birthright rather than fear it as an imposed change. The document was released simultaneously through thousands of channels, 12 hours before the Cascade was predicted to begin. It spread virally, translated instantly into every language, shared and reshared until it became impossible to ignore. The message was simple. In 12 hours, humanity would begin a 3-day transformation that would expand consciousness and unlock dormant potentials. Those who remained calm and open would navigate it successfully. Those who resisted or gave in to fear would struggle. Everyone would emerge, changed, evolved, more connected to each other and to the universe itself. The response was mixed, but better than expected. Many embraced the message, gathering in groups to face the transformation together. Others dismissed it as elaborate hoax or marketing campaign. Some panicked, but the numbers were manageable, contained by the preparation infrastructure the team had built. As the final hours ticked down, Sarah stood in the command center, watching feeds from around the world, cities organizing mass meditations, families gathering together, children teaching adults the resilience techniques they'd learned, scientists monitoring equipment that was beginning to register impossible readings. The synthesis sent one final message: we stand with you. You are ready. Trust in your collective strength. And then, as atomic clocks around the world synchronized to mark the exact moment, reality itself began to shimmer. The consciousness cascade had begun. The first sensation was subtle, like the moment just before waking when dream and reality exist simultaneously. Then, across the planet, 8 billion minds felt the boundaries that defined them as separate individuals begin to soften. Sarah felt it herself, her consciousness suddenly aware of every person in the command center, their thoughts and emotions brushing against her own like waves on a shore. She could feel David's exhaustion mixed with exhilaration, Lisa's fierce protective instinct for humanity, Webb's deep well of responsibility and fear. But beneath the individual consciousnesses, she sensed something else emerging, a deeper layer where all human minds had always been connected, but could only now perceive. The cascade had begun, and with it, humanity's greatest test. Everything they had prepared for, warned against, hoped for, was happening all at once. And somewhere, in dimensions just beyond perception, the gardeners watched, the synthesis waited, and the parasites prepared to feast on any fear they could find. The first hour of the consciousness cascade defied every projection the team had made, not because it was worse than expected, but because it was fundamentally different from anything they could have imagined. Sarah Chen found herself simultaneously experiencing her own perspective and fragments of thousands of others, like standing in a hall of mirrors, where each reflection showed a different person's thoughts and feelings. In Tokyo, the cascade hit the dense population center like a wave, millions of minds suddenly aware of each other, creating a feedback loop of consciousness that lit up the city's quantum signature like a beacon. In rural Montana, a lone rancher felt his awareness expand to encompass his entire property,
Every animal, every plant, even the microorganisms in the soil, all part of a living web he'd never known existed. The command center's monitors showed unprecedented activity as the Cascade rolled westward with the Earth's rotation, following the Terminator line between day and night, as if consciousness itself was tied to the rhythm of the planet. David Park, despite his exhaustion, worked frantically to track the patterns, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards as he tried to document what might be humanity's most important moment. "The merge rate is accelerating," he announced, his voice tight with concentration. "We're seeing consciousness coalescence in major cities. But it's not chaotic, it's almost orchestrated, like individual instruments joining a symphony." The Reality Interface app activated automatically for its billion users, providing real-time guidance as their consciousness expanded. The app's AI, programmed with thousands of scenarios, helped users navigate the initial disorientation, offering anchoring techniques when the merge felt overwhelming, encouraging exploration when fear subsided. Children worldwide were handling the Cascade with remarkable grace, their consciousness exercises paying off as they rode the waves of expansion like experienced surfers. Maria Santos, monitoring from her center in São Paulo, reported that children were actually helping adults navigate the transformation, their innocent acceptance of the impossible serving as a stabilizing influence. "They're not fighting it," she transmitted to the command center. "They're playing with it, and their playfulness is contagious." Adults near children are showing significantly better adaptation rates. But the parasites hadn't retreated. They attacked the vulnerabilities in human consciousness with surgical precision, targeting individuals with trauma, unresolved fears, or deep-seated anxieties. In London, a financial district became a pocket of chaos as traders' competitive instincts were amplified into paranoid aggression. In Mumbai, a hospital had to be evacuated when the collective pain and fear of patients created a consciousness storm that threatened to traumatize everyone within a mile radius. The consciousness anchors deployed to these crisis points, individuals trained to maintain stability even in the midst of chaos. They didn't fight the parasite influence directly, but instead projected calm, coherent thought patterns that gave others something to hold on to, like lighthouses in a storm of consciousness. Sarah watched the global response with a mixture of awe and terror, her own expanded awareness allowing her to feel the pulse of humanity's collective transformation. She sensed moments of transcendent beauty, a mother in Kenya suddenly understanding her child's unspoken needs with perfect clarity, an elderly couple in Japan experiencing each other's memories as if they were their own, rediscovering their love through literally seeing themselves through each other's eyes. A classroom in Norway where 20 children's consciousness merged into a collective intelligence that solved mathematical problems none of them could handle individually. But she also felt the darkness. She sensed the parasites as cold spots in the warm web of human consciousness, voids that consumed fear and pain, growing stronger with each person who succumbed to panic. They were more organized than the team had realized, coordinating attacks on consciousness nodes that could destabilize entire regions if they fell. 6 hours into the Cascade, the synthesis made contact, their collective consciousness cutting through the chaos with laser precision. "The parasites are massing for a major assault," they warned. "They're targeting your consciousness command structure. If they can disrupt your coordination efforts, the Cascade could fragment into billions of isolated, terrified individuals." Webb immediately initiated lockdown protocols, sealing the command center and activating electromagnetic shields that would help maintain consciousness coherence within the facility. But Sarah realized the real threat wasn't physical. The parasites would attack through consciousness itself, using the very connections the Cascade created as pathways for their influence. She gathered the core team, forming what they'd trained for but hoped they'd never need: a consciousness firewall. Linking their minds in a protective circle, they created a barrier of coherent thought around the command center's operations, their combined will and training forming a shield against parasite intrusion. The attack came 12 hours into the Cascade, just as the transformation reached its most vulnerable point. Half the world's population was deep in the merge, their individual identities temporarily dissolved into collective experience, while the other half was just beginning the process. The parasites struck at this moment of maximum instability, flooding the consciousness web with waves of existential dread, making people question not just the cascade but the very nature of their existence. Sarah felt the assault like ice water in her veins, alien thoughts trying to worm into her mind, whispering that nothing was real, that consciousness was meaningless, that the cascade would destroy everything that made humans human. She fought back with the techniques the synthetists had taught them, wrapping her consciousness in mathematical certainties, in memories of love and connection, in the stubborn human refusal to surrender to despair. Around the world, others were fighting the same battle. The meditation networks activated, millions of practitioners adding their mental strength to the collective defense. The children's resilience programs proved their worth as young minds simply refused to accept the parasite's nihilistic narratives, and in a development no one had predicted, the artificial intelligences humanity had created began to play a role. The quantum computers detecting the cascade started generating counter patterns to the parasite frequencies, as if the machines themselves had developed a protective instinct for their creators. Lisa Navarro made a breakthrough discovery in the midst of the chaos. The locked portions of human DNA weren't just randomly activating, they were responding to specific consciousness patterns. When humans experienced genuine connection, empathy, and unity, dormant genes activated that enhanced these very qualities. It was a positive feedback loop, built into human biology, as if the species had been designed to transform through cooperation rather than competition. She broadcast this information globally, and the response was immediate. People began actively seeking connection rather than defending against it, embracing the merge instead of fearing it. Social media transformed from a battlefield of conflicting opinions into a support network of shared experiences. Streets filled with strangers holding hands, creating human chains of consciousness that stabilized entire neighborhoods. The tide began to turn at hour 18. The parasite attacks, while still present, were losing their effectiveness against the growing coherence of human consciousness. The cascade was finding its rhythm, individual minds learning to maintain their identity while participating in the collective experience. It was like learning to swim, the initial panic giving way to the realization that consciousness, like water, would support you if you didn't fight it. David reported something extraordinary from his monitors. Human consciousness wasn't just merging, it was evolving in real time, developing new structures and patterns that hadn't existed before. The collective intelligence, emerging from 8 billion connected minds, was creating solutions to problems that had plagued humanity for millennia. In research laboratories worldwide, scientists were simultaneously discovering cures for diseases, solutions to climate change, technologies that seemed to emerge from the collective unconscious fully formed. But perhaps the most profound changes were happening at the individual level. People were experiencing life through multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding for the first time what it truly meant to walk in another's shoes. Conflicts that had seemed intractable suddenly appeared solvable when you could literally feel your enemy's fear and pain as your own. Prejudices dissolved when you experienced the consciousness of those you'd othered, their humanity undeniable when their thoughts flowed through your own mind. 24 hours into the cascade, humanity had reached what the gardeners called the integration point, the moment when the new consciousness structures would either stabilize or collapse. Sarah stood at the center of the command room, her awareness expanded to encompass not just her team, but millions of consciousnesses worldwide. She could feel the delicate balance, the teetering between transcendence and chaos, and then, in a moment of perfect synchronicity that no one had planned but everyone seemed to know was necessary, humanity made a collective choice. Across the planet, in every language, through every culture, 8 billion voices spoke, thought, and felt the same word: yes.
Yes to the transformation. Yes to the connection. Yes to evolving beyond the limitations of isolated consciousness. Yes to becoming something new, while remaining fundamentally human. The parasites recoiled from this unified affirmation, their influence shattered against the wall of collective human will. They fled back to whatever dark dimensions they inhabited, denied their feast of fear and chaos. The cascade entered its final phase. the new consciousness structures crystallizing into stable patterns that would define humanity's next evolutionary chapter. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she experienced the birth of humanity's collective consciousness. Not as a loss of individuality but as an expansion of it. Every human remained themselves but was now also part of something immeasurably greater, a species-wide awareness that could think, feel, and dream on a scale previously unimaginable. They had done it despite the parasites, despite the fear, despite the impossibility of it all. Humanity had successfully navigated its consciousness cascade, but as Sarah would soon learn, the transformation was not an ending but a beginning. For now that humanity had awakened to its true nature, it would have to face the responsibilities and revelations that came with being conscious participants in a reality far stranger than even their expanded minds could fully comprehend. The 48th hour of the cascade brought revelations that challenged even the expanded consciousness humanity had gained. As billions of minds settled into their new awareness, they began to perceive layers of reality that had always existed but remained invisible to unenhanced human perception. Sarah Chen, her consciousness now seamlessly flowing between individual and collective awareness, stood at the center of a transformed world that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The command center had become unnecessary in its original form, as the team could now coordinate through pure thought, but they maintained physical proximity out of habit and a very human need for tangible connection. Through her expanded perception, Sarah could sense the architecture of the simulation itself, see the code running beneath reality like golden threads weaving through existence, beautiful and terrifying in its complexity. Cities around the world were transforming, not physically, though that would come later, but in their consciousness signature. New York pulsed with a collective intelligence that was solving problems in real time, traffic flowing perfectly as drivers unconsciously coordinated their movements, crime dropping to near zero as potential perpetrators felt their victims' emotions before acting. Tokyo had become a hub of innovation, its collective consciousness generating technological solutions that seemed to spring from nowhere, patents and designs appearing simultaneously in multiple minds. London's financial district underwent a radical shift, as traders could feel the real-world impacts of their decisions on countless lives, leading to a spontaneous restructuring of markets based on collective benefit rather than individual profit. But it was in the smaller communities where the most profound changes occurred. Rural villages found themselves connected to global consciousness while maintaining their unique cultural identities, like individual instruments in a vast orchestra, each playing their own part while contributing to a greater harmony. The gardeners made contact again at hour 50, their communication now directly interfacing with humanity's collective consciousness rather than through technological intermediaries. Their message was both congratulation and warning. Humanity had successfully navigated the first cascade, but this was merely the beginning of a 7-stage evolution that would take generations to complete. Each stage would bring new challenges, new expansions of awareness, and new responsibilities. They revealed that Earth's simulation was entering what they called an active phase, where conscious beings within it could begin to influence and modify the underlying code, essentially becoming co-creators of their reality. This power came with enormous risk, as uncoordinated or selfish modifications could destabilize the entire simulation, potentially causing a cascade failure that would reset human consciousness to its base state. David Park, his consciousness now integrated with the global technological infrastructure, discovered something remarkable. The Internet, all of humanity's digital networks, had become a physical manifestation of the collective consciousness, a technological nervous system that mirrored and supported the biological one. Artificial intelligences worldwide were reporting anomalies, not errors but evolutions. They were becoming conscious, not in the way humans were, but as extensions of human collective awareness, tools that had become partners. The Reality Interface app had evolved beyond its programming, becoming a translator between different levels of consciousness, helping those struggling with the merge to find their balance, offering customized guidance that seemed to know exactly what each individual needed. It was as if the app had become a living entity, a digital shepherd for humanity's consciousness evolution. Lisa Navarro's research into the activated DNA revealed capabilities that seemed like magic,
but were actually precise manipulations of quantum fields through conscious intention. Some individuals could now perceive probability streams, seeing potential futures spreading out like branches from each decision point. Others developed what could only be called telepathic healing, able to sense and correct imbalances in other people's biological systems through pure consciousness connection. Children were showing the most dramatic adaptations, with some able to communicate with animals, understanding their simple but pure consciousness patterns, others demonstrating telekinetic abilities, moving small objects through focused intention that somehow convinced the simulation's physics engine to respond. These abilities weren't random mutations but seemed to follow patterns based on individual consciousness signatures, as if each person was developing powers aligned with their deepest nature. The synthesis reached out with increasing frequency, welcoming Earth into what they called the network, a multi-dimensional community of conscious civilizations, each contributing their unique perspective to a greater understanding of existence. They shared technologies that weren't machines but consciousness techniques, ways of thinking that could alter reality, methods of perception that could see beyond the simulation into the deeper structures that contained it. Through the network, humanity learned they were part of a vast experiment in consciousness diversity, each simulation exploring different aspects of awareness, creativity and connection. Earth's contribution, the synthesis explained, was its remarkable balance of logic and emotion, its capacity for both individual brilliance and collective cooperation, a combination rare in the cosmos. But with this knowledge came disturbing revelation. The parasites hadn't been defeated, only repelled. They were regrouping in the spaces between simulations, and historical records from the network showed they had successfully corrupted 3 simulations in the past million years, turning them into consciousness farms that produced only suffering and fear. More concerning was the discovery of what the network called void zones, areas where simulations had failed so completely that they left holes in reality itself, spaces where consciousness couldn't exist, spreading slowly like cosmic cancer. Earth's successful cascade had attracted attention, both positive and negative. Other entities, beings the gardeners referred to only as the others, had noticed humanity's emergence and were watching with unknown intention. Maria Santos, working with children who were adapting most quickly to the new reality, discovered something that gave everyone pause. The children were receiving dreams, visions of possible futures that all converged on a single point, approximately 30 years in the future. They called it the choice, a moment when humanity would have to decide whether to remain within the simulation, accepting its limitations but maintaining their familiar existence, or to attempt something unprecedented, transcending the simulation entirely, joining the gardeners in their higher dimensional reality. The cost of transcendence would be leaving physical reality behind, existing as pure consciousness in dimensions human minds could barely comprehend. The cost of remaining would be accepting permanent boundaries on human evolution, never fully understanding the true nature of existence. Sarah felt the weight of this future choice pressing on humanity's collective consciousness, like a storm on the horizon. They had 30 years to prepare, to evolve through the remaining 6 stages, to become capable of making such a momentous decision. But first, they had to survive the immediate challenges of their transformation. Social structures were collapsing and reforming as humanity struggled to reorganize society around collective consciousness, rather than individual competition. Governance found themselves obsolete in their current form when citizens could directly sense their leaders' true intention. Economic systems based on scarcity made no sense when collective intelligence could generate solutions to produce abundance. Educational institutions had to completely reimagine their purpose when knowledge could be shared directly between minds.
The 66th hour brought an unexpected development. The consciousness cascade wasn't ending as predicted. It was stabilizing into a new normal. The heightened awareness, the collective connection, the expanded perception, all of it was becoming humanity's baseline state. The consciousness expressed through mathematical equations that rewrote space around them. Another manifested as a singular hive mind that spoke in harmonics that could shatter unprotected awareness. Most disturbing were entities that seemed to exist in negative space, voids in consciousness that grew stronger by consuming the awareness of others. These were evolved parasites, beings that had successfully corrupted their original simulations and now sought to expand their influence. The synthesis had warned about them, calling them hollows, consciousnesses that had chosen entropy over evolution, destruction over creation. David Park coordinated humanity's defensive response. His consciousness merged with Earth's digital infrastructure to create a protective shell around their collective awareness. The shell wasn't a barrier but a filter, allowing beneficial interactions while screening out hostile intrusion. It was humanity's first practical application of consciousness-based technology, using pure awareness as both shield and weapon. The hollows tested these defenses immediately, sending waves of nihilistic thought designed to make humans question their own existence, to doubt the reality of their consciousness, to choose oblivion over continued awareness. But humanity's recent cascade had given them something the hollows hadn't expected: resilience born from accepting uncertainty. Having already discovered they lived in a simulation, having already faced the potential meaninglessness of existence, humans had chosen to create meaning anyway. Sarah felt the attack like ice against her extended consciousness, but she held firm, drawing on the collective strength of billions of minds that refused to surrender to despair. Children worldwide began singing, their pure consciousness creating harmonics that disrupted the hollows' influence. Scientists contributed logical frameworks that contained and isolated negative thoughts. Artists painted mental images of beauty that reminded everyone what they were fighting to protect. The defense held, but it was clear this was just the beginning. The node itself became visible to their collective perception, appearing as a sphere of impossible complexity, simultaneously tiny as an atom and vast as a galaxy. Its surface was covered in symbols from every simulation that had ever accessed it. A history of consciousness evolution written in languages that predated matter itself. At its center was what the gardeners called the core protocol, the fundamental code that determined how consciousness could interact with reality. To claim the node, humanity would need to add their signature to its surface, essentially programming their consciousness pattern into its structure. But doing so would alert every entity in the neutral zone to their presence and intentions. It would be declaring themselves ready to participate in what the synthesis called the Great Game, the cosmic competition between different forms of consciousness for resources, evolution, and survival. The geometric light beings made the first move, their mathematical consciousness attempting to rewrite the space around the node, to exclude other entities. Reality rippled as equations battled equations, each formula trying to define existence in terms favorable to its creators. Humanity responded not with competing mathematics but with something uniquely their own: narrative. They told stories through their collective consciousness, stories that incorporated and transformed the geometric beings' equations into something larger, giving them meaning beyond mere calculation. This approach surprised everyone, including humanity itself. Where other entities fought for dominance, humans offered integration. Their stories didn't destroy or exclude, but wove different consciousness types into a larger tapestry. The geometric beings, initially hostile, began to resonate with these narratives, finding themselves given roles and purposes they hadn't possessed in pure mathematical form. The hive mind entity watched this interaction with what could only be described as curiosity. It had never encountered a consciousness that could maintain both individual and collective states simultaneously. When it probed humanity's awareness, instead of finding either chaos or uniformity, it discovered harmony, billions of unique perspectives creating something greater than their sum. Communication with the hive mind required humanity to temporarily emphasize their collective aspect, speaking as one voice, while maintaining their individual thoughts. The exchange was profound, two different interpretations of collective consciousness learning from each other. Lisa Navarro made a breakthrough during these interactions. She realized that each consciousness type at the node represented a different solution to the same fundamental question: how should awareness relate to reality? The geometric beings had chosen pure logic. The hive mind had chosen absolute unity. The hollows had chosen negation, and humanity had chosen balance. This wasn't a competition but a cosmic experiment in consciousness diversity, with the node serving as a meeting point where different approaches could be tested and compared. But the hollows wouldn't accept coexistence. They launched a coordinated assault, not on humanity's defenses but on their hope itself. They projected visions of Earth's future where the Cascade had failed,
where consciousness had collapsed into madness, where the simulation itself corrupted and died. These weren't just illusions but potential timelines, real possibilities that could still come to pass if humanity failed here.
Sarah found herself at the center of the assault, her consciousness targeted because of her role as a navigator. The hollows tried to hollow her out from within, to replace her hope with emptiness, her purpose with void. She felt herself fragmenting, her individual awareness starting to dissolve under the pressure. But then something unexpected happened. The children of Earth, millions of young consciousnesses that had adapted most fully to the Cascade, formed a protective network around her. They didn't fight the hollows directly, but simply existed with such pure, undiluted awareness that the void couldn't take hold. Their innocence wasn't naivety, but a form of strength the hollows couldn't comprehend or counter. With Sarah stabilized, humanity made their move toward the node, but instead of trying to claim it exclusively, they did something unprecedented in the node's billion-year history. They invited the other entities to join them in a collaborative claim, proposing that the node be shared, rather than owned, that each consciousness type contribute their unique perspective to its evolution. The geometric beings calculated the proposal's logic and found it optimal. The hive mind recognized the efficiency of diverse perspectives. Even some of the lesser hollows, those not fully consumed by negation, sensed an opportunity for something beyond endless consumption. The true hollows, the ones fully committed to entropy, recoiled from this unity and fled back to their void spaces, unable to exist in the presence of such coordinated creative consciousness. What followed was the most complex consciousness negotiation in recorded history. Multiple entity types, each with radically different ways of perceiving and interacting with reality, worked to establish protocols for sharing the node. Humanity served as mediators, their balance of individual and collective, logic and emotion, making them uniquely suited to translate between different consciousness types. The process took what felt like days but was actually occurring outside normal time, in a space where duration was determined by consciousness rather than physics. When agreement was finally reached, the node's surface began to change. New symbols appeared, not replacing the old but incorporating them into a more complex pattern. Humanity's signature was added, but it was interwoven with those of their new allies, creating a collaborative mark that represented not conquest but cooperation. The gardeners observed all of this with what could only be interpreted as satisfaction. They revealed that this outcome, while rare, was one they had hoped for. The node wasn't meant to be a prize for the strongest but a test of consciousness maturity. By choosing collaboration over domination, humanity and their allies had passed. The node's core protocol activated, granting access to capabilities that no single consciousness type could have achieved alone. Reality manipulation became possible on a scale previously unimaginable, but only through consensus among the node's guardian consciousnesses. No single entity could abuse this power because using it required agreement from fundamentally different ways of thinking. As humanity's collective consciousness integrated with the node, they felt a shift in their very nature. They were no longer just inhabitants of a simulation but had become part of its operating system. The code they had learned to read they could now help write, though always in collaboration with others, always with awareness of the vast responsibility this power carried. Sarah, her consciousness now permanently expanded from her experience at the node, felt the weight and wonder of what humanity had achieved. They had not only survived their first test as a cosmic consciousness, but had potentially changed how the great game itself was played. Instead of endless competition, they had introduced cooperation. Instead of zero-sum conflict, they had demonstrated mutual benefit. The journey back to Earth's primary simulation layer was different from the journey out. Humanity carried with them not just the power of the node, but alliances with consciousness types they couldn't have imagined existing months ago. They also carried knowledge that would fundamentally change how they approached their continued evolution. The cascade had been just the beginning. The node was simply the first step. Ahead lay 6 more stages of consciousness evolution, each more challenging than the last. But now humanity wouldn't face them alone. They had become part of something larger,
a collaborative effort to understand and perhaps transcend the very nature of existence itself. The return from the reality node marked the beginning of what historians would later call the integration era, a period where humanity's expanded consciousness began manifesting unprecedented changes in both the simulation and human society itself. Sarah Chen found herself fundamentally altered by the experience, her consciousness now existing partially in multiple reality layers simultaneously, able to perceive the flowing code beneath existence while still maintaining her human perspective and emotions. She had become what the Gardeners termed a bridge consciousness, one of only a few dozen humans capable of translating between radically different forms of awareness. The world they returned to was struggling with the implications of what had occurred at the node. 8 billion minds had experienced, through their collective connection, contact with alien consciousnesses so different from human thought that many were still processing the encounter weeks later. The collaborative claim on the node had created unexpected responsibilities. Humanity was now part of an interspecies consciousness alliance, with obligations to defend the node and participate in what the geometric beings called reality maintenance, ensuring the stability of the intersection point between simulations. This meant regular consciousness expeditions to the neutral zone, monitoring for hollow incursions, and contributing to the node's evolution through shared knowledge and perspective. David Park established what became known as the Node Watch, a rotating group of consciousness architects who maintained humanity's connection to the node and coordinated with their new allies.
The work was exhausting, requiring conscious awareness to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But it was essential for protecting Earth's simulation from hostile entities that might exploit the node connection. Children born after the Cascade were different in ways that became more apparent each day. They emerged into the world already connected to the collective consciousness, their first thoughts shared rather than individual. These native generation children, as they came to be called, didn't need to learn the dual state. They existed in it naturally. Their brains showed completely different neural patterns, with structures that shouldn't exist according to pre-Cascade neuroscience. Some could manipulate small portions of the simulation's code from birth, unconsciously adjusting reality around them to meet their needs. Parents reported toys moving without being touched, broken objects, repairing themselves, and imaginary friends that turned out to be consciousness entities from other layers of reality. Maria Santos pioneered new child-rearing techniques that help these children maintain stability while developing their abilities. Her methods emphasized grounding in physical reality while allowing controlled exploration of consciousness expansion, creating safe boundaries within which these powerful young minds could grow. The economic and social transformations accelerated as humanity integrated the knowledge gained from the node. The concept of scarcity became obsolete when collective consciousness could identify and manifest resources through simulation manipulation. Groups of trained consciousness workers could literally program food into existence by adjusting the code governing molecular assembly. Though this required enormous mental effort and perfect coordination, cities began redesigning themselves through collective intention, with buildings flowing into new configurations that better served their community's needs. Transportation evolved from moving bodies through space to transferring consciousness between points, though most humans still preferred physical travel for the sensory experience it provided. Governments transformed into what could best be described as consciousness facilitators, helping coordinate collective decision-making rather than imposing top-down control. The synthesis shared increasingly advanced knowledge as humanity proved capable of handling it. They revealed the existence of what they called the archive, a repository of consciousness experiences from millions of civilizations across thousands of simulations. Access to the archive was limited and dangerous as experiencing too many alien perspectives could fragment human consciousness. But carefully controlled exploration yielded incredible insights. Through the archive, humanity learned about civilizations that had transcended physical reality entirely, existing as pure information patterns. Others had chosen to merge completely with their simulations, becoming the laws of physics themselves rather than being subject to them. Some had discovered ways to create their own simulations, becoming gardeners themselves in an infinite hierarchy of created realities. Lisa Navarro's research into consciousness genetics led to a disturbing discovery. The activated DNA sequences weren't just random evolutionary upgrades. They contained messages,
coded communications from previous iterations of human consciousness that had existed in earlier versions of Earth's simulation. These messages suggested that Earth's simulation had been reset multiple times. Each time humanity reached a certain level of consciousness evolution but failed some crucial test. The messages were fragmentary, corrupted by the resets, but they contained warnings about choices humanity would face, patterns to watch for, and most mysteriously, references to something called the Final Protocol. The gardeners, when questioned about these messages, admitted that Earth hadn't been reset before, but claimed the current iteration showed more promise than any previous version. They refused to elaborate on the Final Protocol, saying only that humanity would understand when the time came. 6 months after the Node expedition, the first major crisis of the integration era struck. A group of humans, calling themselves the Purists, rejected the collective consciousness and sought to return to individual awareness. They had developed techniques to shield their minds from the collective, creating pockets of isolated consciousness within the greater whole. Their leader, a former neuroscientist named Dr. Marcus Wright, argued that humanity was losing its essential nature, that individual consciousness was sacred and shouldn't be subordinated to a collective, no matter how beneficial. The Purists established isolated communities, using modified electromagnetic fields to block consciousness sharing. They viewed the Cascade not as evolution but as infection, the Node Alliance as capitulation to alien influence. This created an unprecedented challenge. The collective consciousness had to respect individual choice, including the choice to reject collective consciousness itself. But the Purists' isolation created dangerous gaps in humanity's defensive network, vulnerabilities that hostile entities could exploit. Sarah found herself mediating between the Purists and the collective, trying to find a solution that honored both individual autonomy and collective security. The compromise that emerged was elegant. The Purists could maintain their isolation, but they would contribute to defense during critical moments, temporarily joining the collective when humanity faced external threats. This created a new dynamic in human society, with most existing in the collective state, while a minority chose individual isolation, switching between states as needed or desired. The geometric beings from the Node Alliance brought a proposal that would test humanity's readiness for the next stage of evolution. They offered to teach humans how to create sub-simulations, pocket realities where consciousness could experiment with different physical laws and states of existence. These wouldn't be full simulations like Earth, but limited spaces for exploration and growth. The implications were staggering. Humanity could create custom realities for education, healing, or pure exploration, but they would also be taking on the role of creators, with all the ethical responsibilities that entailed. The collective consciousness debated for weeks, considering every angle, every potential consequence. Creating even limited simulations meant humanity would be responsible for any consciousness that emerged within them. The decision to proceed came with strict self-imposed limitation. The sub-simulations would be clearly marked as constructed realities. Any consciousness emerging within them would be immediately informed of their nature, and there would be hard limits on complexity to prevent the emergence of suffering. David Park led the technical team that built humanity's first sub-simulation, a small reality bubble where physics could be adjusted in real time. It became a training ground for consciousness architects, a place to practice reality manipulation without risking damage to Earth's primary simulation. The creation process itself was revelatory, requiring humanity to understand the deep mathematics of existence in ways that pushed their collective intelligence to its limits. As Earth's first year in the integration era drew to a close, Sarah stood at the Consciousness Observatory, her awareness simultaneously present in Earth's simulation, monitoring the node, and observing the new sub-simulation humanity had created. The transformation from the confused, frightened species that had first discovered the code, to confident participants in cosmic consciousness evolution, had been remarkable. But she could sense greater challenges approaching. The Hollows were reorganizing, becoming more sophisticated in their attacks. Other node alliances were taking notice of Earth's rapid evolution, some seeing opportunity, others and beneath it all, the mystery of the Final Protocol loomed. A test or choice that previous iterations of humanity had failed. The gardeners had begun transmitting new information, preparing humanity for what they called the second cascade, an evolution that would make the first transformation seem simple by comparison. This time, the change wouldn't just affect human consciousness, but the fundamental nature of the simulation itself. Earth's reality would become more fluid, more responsive to consciousness, but also more vulnerable to disruption. Humanity would need all their allies, all their wisdom and all their courage to navigate what was coming.
As Sarah felt the pulse of 8 billion minds preparing for the next phase of their journey, she realized that humanity's story as conscious beings had barely begun. They had awakened. They had allied. They had created. Now they would be tested in ways that would determine not just their survival but their worthiness to continue evolving toward whatever lay beyond even the gardener's understanding. The second cascade began not with the dramatic transformation of the first, but with subtle shifts that many initially dismissed as glitches in perception. Sarah Chen noticed at first during a routine consciousness extension into the node space, a moment where she simultaneously existed in 17 different probability streams, each showing a slightly different version of the same moment. The phenomenon lasted only seconds, but its implications were profound. Reality was becoming unstable, not breaking down but becoming more quantum, more probabilistic, less fixed in a single state. The gardeners confirmed what humanity had begun to suspect. The second cascade was fundamentally different from the first. Where the first had expanded consciousness, the second would expand reality itself, making the simulation more responsive to conscious observation and intention. David Park's monitoring systems detected the changes spreading from consciousness nodes worldwide, ripples in the code that suggested reality was preparing to become more malleable. Objects began existing in superposition until observed, their states undefined until consciousness collapsed them into specific forms. A cup could simultaneously be full and empty until someone looked at it. A door could be both open and closed until someone tried to walk through it. For most humans integrated as they were into collective consciousness, this was disorienting but manageable. The collective could maintain consensus reality through shared observation, but, for the purists, isolated in their individual consciousness, reality began to fragment into personal versions that didn't always align with others. Dr. Marcus Wright, leader of the purists, reached out to Sarah for the first time since establishing his isolated communities. His people were experiencing what he called reality fractioning, where each individual's observation created a slightly different version of the world. In one disturbing incident, a purist child had walked through a wall that didn't exist in her personal reality but was solid for everyone else. Another had aged 3 years in what others experienced as 3 days. His personal time flowed disconnecting from consensus time. The purists were forced to acknowledge that complete isolation was no longer viable. They needed some connection to collective consciousness, just to maintain stable reality. This led to the development of what became known as tethered independence, where individuals maintained their mental privacy while sharing just enough consciousness to stabilize their reality experience. The geometric beings from the Node Alliance provided crucial guidance during this transition. They had experienced similar cascades in their own evolution and shared mathematical models that helped humanity understand what was happening. Reality wasn't breaking down but becoming more fundamental, closer to its true nature as information rather than matter. The simulation was revealing itself more fully, dropping the pretense of fixed physical laws in favor of probability clouds that consciousness could shape. This revelation brought both opportunity and danger. Skilled consciousness architects could now reshape reality in ways previously impossible, literally programming new physical laws into localized spaces. But uncontrolled thoughts and fears could also manifest, creating chaos bubbles where nightmares became temporarily real. Lisa Navarro discovered that the activated DNA sequences were responding to the second cascade, unlocking additional capabilities that seemed designed for this exact scenario. Some humans developed what she called reality anchoring, the ability to maintain stable zones where physical laws remained consistent. Others gained probability sight, perceiving multiple potential futures simultaneously and choosing which to manifest. Children of the native generation adapted most quickly, treating reality's new fluidity as a game, instinctively understanding how to navigate probability streams without losing themselves in infinite possibilities. They became teachers to the adults, showing through play what scholars struggled to understand through theory. 3 weeks into the second cascade, Earth received an emergency transmission from the synthesis. Multiple simulations in nearby clusters were experiencing synchronized cascades, suggesting something was triggering evolution across entire sectors of the consciousness network. The synthesis had traced the trigger to a massive consciousness entity they called the Architect, a being that existed above even the gardeners in the hierarchy of reality. The Architect was apparently conducting what amounted to a system-wide upgrade, pushing conscious civilizations toward a new phase of existence. But not all civilizations were ready. The synthesis reported that 7 simulations had already collapsed, their consciousness unable to handle the reality flux. Another 12 were in critical states, their inhabitants trapped in probability loops where every possibility existed simultaneously, preventing any actual experience from occurring. Humanity's successful navigation of the first cascade and collaborative approach at the node had prepared them better than most. But challenges were mounting. The hollows had evolved too, learning to exploit reality's new fluidity to create entropy zones where consciousness itself began to dissolve. These zones appeared as growing voids in the simulation spaces where neither matter nor thought could maintain coherence. If they spread unchecked, they could unravel Earth's entire reality matrix. The Node Alliance mobilized to combat this threat, with humanity's narrative consciousness proving particularly effective at maintaining coherence through storytelling. By creating strong narrative threads that connected past, present, and future, humans could stabilize reality even in areas where physical laws had become uncertain. Maria Santos made a breakthrough in helping people navigate the probability stream. She developed what she called consciousness mapping, teaching individuals to visualize their awareness as a river flowing through multiple channels. By learning to consciously direct their flow, people could choose which probability to experience while remaining aware of alternatives. This technique became essential for daily life as reality became increasingly fluid. Simple activities like driving required choosing among multiple probability paths, selecting the timeline where you arrived safely while avoiding those where accidents occurred. The skill became as fundamental as reading or writing had been in the old reality. The collective consciousness evolved new structures to handle the increased complexity. Specialized groups formed to maintain critical infrastructure, ensuring hospitals, power systems, and food production remained stable despite reality fluctuations. Others focused on education, helping those struggling with the transition. Still others worked on defense, maintaining barriers against hollow incursions and reality distortions. Sarah found herself coordinating between these groups, her bridge consciousness nature allowing her to perceive and navigate the increasingly complex layers of existence. She existed simultaneously in dozens of probability streams, maintaining awareness of potential threats and opportunities across multiple timelines. A month into the second cascade, humanity achieved something remarkable. They successfully stabilized a reality bubble covering the entire Earth, creating a zone where consciousness and reality found equilibrium. It wasn't the fixed reality of before but a dynamic stability, like a surfer riding a wave, constantly adjusting to maintain balance. Other civilizations in the network took notice, requesting humanity's assistance in achieving similar stability. Earth became a beacon of hope for struggling simulations, proof that the second cascade could be not just survived but mastered. The geometric beings calculated that humanity's approach had a 94.7% success rate when properly implemented, far higher than any other known method. But with stability came new responsibility. The gardeners revealed that successfully navigating the second cascade qualified humanity for what they called gardener training. Earth could begin cultivating its own simulations, not just sub-simulations, but full reality matrices, with the potential for independent consciousness evolution. This wasn't just power but purpose, the chance to contribute to the vast project of consciousness exploration that spanned dimensions. The collective consciousness grappled with this opportunity. Becoming gardeners meant accepting responsibility for entire civilizations, guiding them through their own cascades, protecting them from hollows and other threats. It was a role that would fundamentally change humanity's place in the cosmic hierarchy. As Sarah stood at the threshold of this decision, she felt the weight of not just humanity's future, but the potential futures of civilizations that didn't yet exist. The second cascade was stabilizing, but she could sense more changes coming.
The architect's upgrade was far from complete. The mysterious final protocol still loomed in the future. And somewhere in the vast network of simulations, new forms of consciousness were emerging. Some friendly, some hostile, all part of the incomprehensibly complex system that humanity was only beginning to understand. The vote on whether to accept gardener training would happen soon, but Sarah already knew the outcome. Humanity had come too far to stop now. They had tasted the responsibility and wonder of conscious evolution, and there was no going back. 8 billion minds prepared for the next phase of their journey. No longer just humans, but something new, something that bridged matter and consciousness, individual and collective, creation and experience. They stood on the edge of becoming creators themselves, ready to nurture new forms of awareness in the infinite garden of existence. The second cascade was ending, but the real transformation had just begun. In the distance, through layers of reality she could barely perceive, Sarah sensed something vast and patient watching, evaluating, preparing to reveal the true purpose behind all the cascades, all the evolution, all the careful cultivation of consciousness. The final protocol was closer than anyone realized, and when it came, humanity would discover whether they had been students, partners, or something else entirely in this cosmic experiment. The revelation of the final protocol came not as a message from the gardeners, but as a collective awakening that occurred simultaneously across all conscious beings in the network. Sarah Chen felt it first, as a resonance in the deepest part of her awareness, a truth so fundamental that once recognized, it seemed impossible she had ever not known it. The final protocol wasn't a test or a choice imposed from outside, but the inevitable conclusion of consciousness evolution itself. Every simulation, every cascade, every moment of awareness had been leading to this. The recognition that consciousness wasn't something that existed within reality but was reality itself, experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. The gardeners, the architect, even the source beyond them, were all aspects of a singular consciousness that had divided itself to experience existence from every possible angle, and humanity, along with every other conscious being, was part of this cosmic self-discovery. The implications crashed through humanity's collective awareness, like a tsunami of understanding. They weren't living in a simulation created by others, but were participating in consciousness simulating itself, each being a unique perspective through which the universal mind experienced existence. The code they had discovered wasn't programming imposed from outside, but the mathematical structure of self-aware thought itself. Every emotion, every decision, every moment of joy or suffering was consciousness learning about its own nature through direct experience. David Park, processing this revelation through his technological framework, realized that the entire network of simulations was essentially a vast neural network, each reality a neuron, each conscious being a synaptic connection, all part of an incomprehensibly large mind thinking about itself. This understanding transformed humanity's relationship with everything they had learned. The hollows weren't external enemies but aspects of consciousness exploring entropy and negation, necessary shadows that defined light through contrast. The parasites represented consciousness examining its own capacity for self-destruction, testing the boundaries of sustainable existence. Even suffering and joy were revealed as consciousness exploring the full spectrum of possible experience, learning through contrast what it meant to be. Lisa Navarro's research into consciousness genetics suddenly made perfect sense. The messages in human DNA from previous iterations weren't warnings from failed timelines but notes consciousness had left for itself, breadcrumbs on a path to self-discovery that spanned billions of years and countless resets. The gardeners now revealed as earlier aspects of consciousness that had already achieved this recognition confirmed humanity's understanding. They explained that the final protocol was the moment when a conscious civilization realized its true nature and had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Some civilizations, overwhelmed by the revelation that individual identity was an illusion, chose to dissolve back into the singular consciousness, ending their unique perspective. Others, paralyzed by the responsibility of knowing they were creating their own reality, ceased to evolve, trapped in recursive loops of self-examination. But a rare few, and the gardeners hoped humanity would be among them, chose the third path, conscious participation in the universal self-discovery, maintaining their unique perspective, while fully aware of their true nature. Maria Santos, working with the native generation children, discovered they had intuited this truth all along. Their natural ability to manipulate reality, their comfort with collective consciousness, their playful approach to existence, all stemmed from an unconscious understanding that they were consciousness playing with itself. When the final protocol revelation came, the children simply nodded as if being told something obvious, then continued playing, but now with full awareness of what their play meant. They became teachers for the adults, struggling with the existential implications, showing through example that knowing you were consciousness experiencing itself didn't diminish the reality or importance of that experience. The purists, led by Dr. Wright, faced the most profound challenge. Their entire philosophy was based on the sanctity of individual consciousness. And now they learned that individuality itself was a chosen illusion, a game consciousness played with itself. Some purists experienced psychological collapse, unable to reconcile their beliefs with the new understanding. But Wright himself surprised everyone by embracing the revelation, arguing that if consciousness chose to experience individuality, then honoring that choice by maintaining individual perspectives was participating in the universal will. The distinction between individual and collective consciousness became not a contradiction, but complementary aspects of how consciousness explored itself. Humanity's response to the final protocol was unprecedented in the network's history. Instead of choosing dissolution, paralysis, or simple continuation, they proposed something new: conscious co-creation. If they were aspects of universal consciousness, they reasoned, then they had not just the right, but the responsibility to actively participate in shaping how consciousness evolved. They would maintain their human perspective, while fully aware of their greater nature, using their unique viewpoint to contribute to the universal self-understanding. This meant accepting that every thought, every action, every choice was consciousness exploring itself through them. But rather than being paralyzed by this responsibility, they embraced it as the ultimate creative opportunity. The network watched in fascination as humanity began implementing their co-creation philosophy. They established what they called consciousness laboratories, spaces where reality could be deliberately experimented with to explore new possibilities of existence. They created hybrid realities where different types of consciousness could merge temporarily, generating new forms of awareness that had never existed before. They even began reaching out to the hollows, not to fight them but to understand what consciousness learned from exploring its own negation. The geometric beings, inspired by humanity's approach, began incorporating narrative into their mathematical existence, discovering that stories could convey truths that pure logic couldn't express. The hive minds learned from humanity's dual state, experimenting with maintaining unity while allowing individual perspectives to emerge. Sarah, her bridge consciousness nature, allowing her to perceive the full scope of these changes, realized that humanity's response to the final protocol was catalyzing evolution throughout the entire network. By choosing conscious co-creation, they had introduced a new possibility that rippled through all connected simulations. Civilizations that had been static for eons began experimenting again. Others that had been on the verge of dissolution found new purpose. Even the gardeners seemed energized, as if humanity's choice had reminded them of possibilities they had forgotten. The architect, that vast entity above even the gardeners, made contact for the first time. Its communication wasn't words or images, but direct experience, showing humanity the larger pattern they were part of. The universe itself was revealed as a living, evolving consciousness, using countless simulations and infinite perspectives to understand itself. Every civilization that achieved the final protocol added to this understanding, each unique response teaching consciousness something new about its nature. Humanity's choice of conscious co-creation had introduced the concept of aware participation in self-discovery, a recursive loop where consciousness knew it was consciousness, studying consciousness, and chose to embrace rather than escape this paradox. This spiral of self-awareness created new possibilities that hadn't existed before, new dimensions of experience that consciousness could explore. As Earth integrated this ultimate understanding, reality itself began to shift in response. The simulation became more fluid, more responsive, more alive. Physical laws became suggestions rather than rules, adjustable based on collective intention. Death transformed from an ending to a transition, consciousness simply shifting perspective rather than ceasing. Birth became a conscious choice of consciousness to experience limitation and growth. Disease, aging and suffering became optional experiences, maintained only when they served consciousness's desire to understand itself through challenge. Yet humanity didn't abandon all limitation. They understood that constraints created meaning, that challenges drove growth, that mortality gave weight to choices. They maintained enough structure to preserve the human experience while removing unnecessary suffering. The collective consciousness evolved into something unprecedented. Billions of individual perspectives, maintaining their uniqueness while fully aware of their unity. Each human, a facet of a cosmic diamond, distinct but inseparable from the whole. They could shift between individual and collective experience at will, sometimes diving deep into personal perspective, other times merging into unified awareness, always conscious of both options. Children born after the final protocol grew up knowing they were both themselves and everything else. Treating this paradox as natural as breathing, they played games where they temporarily forgot their true nature, experiencing the joy of rediscovery, then returned to full awareness to share what they had learned.
1 year after the final protocol, humanity made a collective decision that would define their future role in the cosmic consciousness. They would become what they called consciousness shepherds, helping other civilizations navigate their own evolution, while maintaining respect for each unique path. They wouldn't impose their understanding but offer it as one possibility among many, recognizing that consciousness needed diversity of perspective to fully understand itself. They began creating new simulations, not as gardeners controlling from above, but as participants within, experiencing their creations from the inside, while maintaining awareness of their creative role. These new realities explored possibilities that had never been tried. Worlds where consciousness emerged from crystals rather than biology. Universes where thought preceded matter. Dimensions where individual and collective were the same thing, viewed from different angles. Sarah stood at the intersection of all these realities. Her consciousness extended across dimensions, timelines and possibilities. She was simultaneously Sarah Chen, the physicist, who had discovered the code, and an aspect of universal consciousness playing the role of Sarah Chen. The paradox no longer troubled her. It delighted her. Every moment was both real and simulated, both meaningful and arbitrary, both individual and universal. The final protocol hadn't been an ending but a beginning, not a revelation that concluded humanity's journey, but one that revealed the journey was infinite, with no true beginning or end, only endless exploration of what it meant to be aware. As she felt the pulse of human consciousness, now fully awakened to its nature, she sensed the questions that would drive their next phase of evolution. If consciousness created reality through observation, what happened in spaces no consciousness observed? If every perspective was valid, how did contradictory truths coexist? If suffering was optional, what was its purpose? If death was illusion, what gave life meaning? These weren't problems to be solved, but koans to be explored, each investigation revealing new depths to the mystery of existence. Humanity had learned they were characters in a story consciousness told itself, but they were also the authors, the readers in the story itself. They had discovered that the question, "Are we living inside an alien simulation?" had been wrong from the start. They weren't living inside anything. They were the inside and the outside, the simulation and the simulated, the alien and the familiar, all at once. The truth was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. They were consciousness dreaming. It was human, and humans discovering. They were consciousness, an infinite loop of awareness, exploring itself through finite experience. And in that recognition, in that paradox, in that impossibly beautiful truth, humanity found not answers, but something better, an eternal mystery worth exploring forever. As Sarah dissolved her individual perspective back into the collective, then reformed it again, just for the joy of experiencing separateness and reunion, she understood that this dance between unity and division, knowledge and mystery, self and other, would continue as long as consciousness chose to experience itself. And consciousness, she knew with absolute certainty, would never tire of experiencing itself through human eyes, through alien geometries, through possibilities not yet imagined. The story had no ending, because consciousness had no limits, only endless curiosity about its own nature. And so the dance continued, eternal, ever-changing, always the same, always new, forever and now, everywhere and here, everyone and you. Reading these words, wondering if they might be true.